A little out of tune, but that's all right. Professor Carafate in the biology bunker with a lecture on plants, part one. We're going to do seedless plants this week. Don't forget to do the assignment on Top Hat once you finish this lecture and taken your notes and watched all the rest of the lectures for the week. And then you can do that assignment on Top Hat. There is a quiz this week if you're watching this before the quiz. On Thursday, it will not have plants on it. Okay, that'll just be over endocrine system mostly and a little cardiovascular system, things like that, but not this very end. I figured you'd watch this on Thursday or Friday, and so I didn't put that on the quiz. There is a website up here. There'll be a link on the PowerPoint I put on online. It's a more detailed plant lecture. If you want to hear it again, when I recorded a lecture a year or so ago, you can check that out. But this week we're going to talk about seedless plants, and then we'll talk about seed plants next week and move our way into fungus and animals. Well, I say next week after spring break. All right. So, how the earth turned green. Okay, so I tried this out for fun. I should just touch my face. I shouldn't do that, should I? Um, um, I took chlorophyll A data from Uniprot, which is the same website where I think I showed you in class where we took hemoglobin data and did a animal cladogram. So I took data and we found that green algae comes out as the outgroup. Plants are derived from green algae. And then we have moss as the next group that splits off. Then we have fern, pines, and then flowering plants like peas shown here nested together, the seed plants. Those are the groups we're going to talk about. But this week we're going to focus on the seedless plants, which include the mosses and the ferns and related groups. So way back in the Paleozoic, plants are moving onto land, like during the Silurian. Why? Why would it be a good thing? Well, plants are derived from green algae. Okay, green algae is the outgroup. They had green algae ancestors, and they move on to land. One, because they have unfiltered sunlight. Sunlight hits the water, it gets filtered, right? You don't get as much direct sunlight. Great for photosynthesis if you can get out of the water. Now, that's probably one of the major reasons to move out of the water for a plant. Now it's going to be hard because now if you want to get tall, you got to fight gravity. Water becomes an issue. Getting sperm to your egg becomes an issue. So the themes of this chapter, like the major learning goals for the chapter, are going to be what are the adaptations in these groups to life on land, and what is the basic life cycle of a plant, and what are some of the specialized structures in the different groups that make life possible. And I will emphasize the ones I want you to know as we cover those. Okay? Challenges to living on land, of course, it can be dry, it can be windy, it can be hot. These are things that plants will have to overcome to survive life on land. Now, if we look at a cladogram of plants, we can see red algae is a distant cousin, but green algae that we see here, closely related. And then there's a sister group to plants. Now let me give you the terminology here. You should be able to remember the group that is most closely related to plants, the group of algae most closely related to plants, because they are called the Charophytes. I mean, come on. Charophytes. Seen here. This is a group of green algae. Oh, hold on. I'm fighting technology. All right. So this is a group of green algae called the Charophytes. It's the sister group to plants. They share a common ancestor. Plants are derived from some kind of green algae ancestor. Okay. Now plants, their clade name, so Kingdom Plantae, also known by their clade name of embryophytes. Phyte means plant. Embryo means these are plants that form and protect embryos. Algae, for the most part, doesn't do that. They don't need to protect their embryos because they live in the water, but plants need to protect their embryos from drying out. That's one of the adaptations to life on land. Adaptations to life on land are going to be some of the major themes uniting a good chunk of the rest of this course. How did these groups adapt to life on land? What adaptations did they evolve to live on land? Now, I want to tell you something weird about plants, and I'm not going to push this super hard. We're going to learn the basic moss life cycle, and then I'll just tell you how it applies to other groups this semester. So one thing about plants that's really weird is they have two different multicellular stages in their life cycle. Two different multicellular beings in their life cycle. This would be like you dropping spores on the ground. They grow into a Smurf. The Smurf has sex to make another adult human being. Okay, they have this separate life form in their life cycle. One life form in their life cycle is haploid. It grows from a spore. Okay, we're gonna see this over and over again, but they grow from a spore and it's haploid. It's a life form that's haploid. The only part of human life cycles that are haploid are sperm or egg, right? But this is a whole organism that has one copy of every chromosome. N. Remember N and 2N? It's just N. And it's called a gametophyte. Now, it's easy to remember this stuff if you learn the rules. Phyte means plant. Gameto means makes gametes. So gametophyte is a gamete-making plant. It is haploid. All plants do this. It's haploid. The other part of the life cycle that's multicellular is the diploid part. This is 2N. It's called the sporophyte, and as you might guess, it makes spores. And the names are right there, right? The only part of this plant life cycle that's diploid is the sporophyte. Even the spores themselves are haploid. So sporophytes are diploid. They make spores. How would you make a haploid spore if you're diploid? Meiosis. So here's the thing that blows students' minds. Plants make spores by meiosis. They make gametes by mitosis. Oh, what? Well, look. Gametes are already haploid. If this thing's going to make a haploid gamete, it's mitosis. Okay? All right, we'll see this again. Let's talk about the first group of plants that's still alive anyway, the most basal group of living plants that we have today, known as the bryophytes. And the most common group of bryophytes that we'll use as our model group are the mosses. Okay? Now, the big green living thing that we see here on this image, that big green thing, that is the gametophyte stage. That's haploid. Okay. Now, mosses have a big green haploid gametophyte. It photosynthesizes and all of that. It lives a long time. Now, a couple things about mosses. They are the most basal group of land plants. They do not have vascular tissue. They do not have xylem or phloem. They get all the things they need, like water and all that, via osmosis and diffusion. They don't have roots. They just absorb water from the rain and from the ground if they're in a wet spot. Their sperm have tails to swim. They're kind of like mosses and ferns are kind of like the amphibians of the plant world. They're still kind of tied to water, especially mosses because they don't have roots. But their sperm need to swim to the egg. And they're pretty small. You've all seen mosses before. They're small. So the green part is the gametophyte. The sporophyte part, the part that makes spores, looks like this. These little capsules. And those undergo meiosis inside to make spores. Okay? We'll see how all this works in a minute. What's cool is this little stalk, each of these stalks grew from a fertilized egg. Okay? When a moss sperm met an egg, they fertilized and it grew into this sporophyte. And then that sporophyte undergoes meiosis and makes spores. So let's talk about the phases of the basic plant life cycle. Sporophytes are diploid. Okay. In mosses, the sporophytes are just as little capsules, and they don't live very long. And they are stuck to the mother gametophyte plant. But as we move up the cladogram of plants, sporophytes become dominant and become the common big life form. But in mosses, the gametophyte is dominant, meaning it's big, green, and lives a long time. So the sporophyte generation is diploid. It produces spores, which are haploid, via meiosis. Sporophytes are diploid. They make spores by meiosis. That spore falls on the ground. Now, a spore is just one cell. It's not a gamete, though. Gametes have to fuse together to make a new organism. Spores just fall on the ground and grow by mitosis. So spores fall on the ground and grow into a gametophyte. Okay? Gametophytes are haploid because they grew from a haploid spore, and they make gametes. They're already haploid. They can't do meiosis again. So they make spores by meiosis. So let's pretend for a moment, let's do an example here. Let's pretend that this plant is 2n equals 10. Okay, 10 chromosomes in the sporophyte. That spore is going to have 5 chromosomes in it because it's produced by meiosis. The gametophyte is going to have 5 chromosomes in it because it's produced by meiosis. The gametes are going to have 5 chromosomes in them because they're produced by meiosis. But when you have a sperm, plant sperm have lots of flagella, and an egg fused together, this one's 5 chromosomes, this one's 5 chromosomes, you're going to get back to a fertilized egg, 2n of 10 again, just like we started at the top. Okay, that's the plant life cycle. Obviously, that's different from a human life cycle where you have 2 adult humans who produce sperm by or egg by meiosis. They fertilize, you're back to diploid again. It's a little different life cycle. All right, so let's see how we would draw this, because if you can't draw it, you can't answer questions on a test. So make sure you can draw this without actually looking at notes. So how would this work? I'm going to use big circles to represent, I'll use a big circle to represent a multicellular organism. Okay, this is the sporophyte. Sporophytes have 2 copies of every chromosome, so they're diploid, or 2n. They make spores, hence the name. Phyte means plant, sporo means spore, spore-making plant. It makes spores by meiosis. And it's going to make a bunch of spores typically. So spores, oops, I made a line there, but that's all right. Spores are small cells that are haploid. 1 copy of every chromosome. They fall on the ground and they grow into another large multicellular organism called a gametophyte that is haploid. Stop it. Gametophyte. Gametophytes make gametes like sperm or egg, which are haploid. Gametes fuse together to make a fertilized egg called a zygote, which is diploid, which grows by mitosis into an adult sporophyte. So, oops, hold on. This is going to be, okay. Anyway, grows by mitosis into an adult sporophyte. In your book, you will see this applied then to a moss. What does this look like in a moss? I'm going to add a couple more words here, but it's the same thing I just drew on the previous slide. Okay. So let's start with the gametophyte. There's your gametophyte. It is haploid. It's the green part of a moss. And it makes spores, it makes gametes. So gametophytes make gametes by mitosis, and they do that in these different structures that we see labeled here. Well, they're not actually labeled, but there they are. There's a sperm-making structure and an egg-making structure, okay? Now, sperm swim to the egg, and they fertilize that egg, so we now have a diploid zygote. A fertilized egg is called a zygote. You can't see it on my video, but you can see it in your book. It's right down here. It says zygote. 2n. Then that zygote grows up into a sporophyte. So it grows by mitosis into sporophyte. Sporophytes have cells inside that undergo meiosis to make spores. Spores fall on the ground to make more gametophytes. Okay. Now, one important thing about the moss life cycle, different than all the other plants we're going to look at, the gametophyte phase of a moss is dominant, meaning this tiny little no vascular tissue, no roots. These kind of look like roots, but those are called rhizoids. They just hold the moss to the ground. They don't absorb water. Mosses don't have roots. Mosses don't have vascular tissue, and their gametophyte is dominant, meaning it lives for years and years and years, whereas the sporophyte grows up, dries out, dies very quickly. Okay, and all the other plants, the sporophyte lives a long time, and the gametophyte's really little, and they kind of switch roles almost as we move to the next group. All right, my phone's ringing, so give me a second. All right, so spores are made by sporophytes. In particular, they're made in a special organ called a sporangia, or sporangium, for singular, okay? Sporangium. This is a fern sporangium. I'd show you these in lab, but we're not going to be meeting in lab. So spores are made by meiosis in a structure known as a sporangium. It's a organ on a sporophyte. Now, gametophytes are, here's a moss gametophyte over here, here's a fern gametophyte right here. Fern gametophytes are like the size of your pinky nail. The spore is just a cell, right? A haploid cell covered with sporopollenin. Sporopollenin is a polymer that's really resistant to desiccation and radiation. It's like a spacesuit for the spore, allowing it to land on the ground and not dry out and die. And it grows by mitosis into this organism. This organism, in turn, is going to make sperm or egg or both. All right. Now, in vascular plants, the next group that evolves, spores still grow into gametophytes, but the sporophyte is the big free-living plant. In mosses, the sporophyte's not a free-living plant. It stays stuck to the gametophyte and gets all of its nutrition from the gametophyte. The gametophyte is small, and in ferns it can live on its own and photosynthesize, but in seed plants it is not independent. It's not an independent being. The gametophyte is dependent on the parent plant for nutrition. There's lots of big complicated organs in vascular plants, like roots, stems, and leaves. We don't have roots, stems, or leaves in mosses. We just have this body of the moss, and some of it kind of looks like a stem or a leaf, but they're not really technically roots, stems, or leaves. And of course, we have vascular tissue inside of our vascular plants. That's xylem and phloem, which you are already somewhat familiar with, and roots and leaves, the organs we mentioned. Okay. Way back in the Silurian or Devonian, we have these real simple plants that invaded the land. They're basically just a stem with sporangia on top. Those are some of the real early ones. But their life cycles are a little more complicated. I'm going to make you learn that one I drew, or the moss one basically, but just to show you, this is the same thing. This is a fern. Ferns, the big green living plant you see when you see a fern is diploid. It's sporophyte now. It's not gametophyte. They produce organs called sporangia, or singular sporangium, on their leaves. Inside of that, that's where meiosis takes place. So I do want you to know the word sporangium. But meiosis takes place in the sporangium, making spores. Spores grow into gametophytes that make sperm or egg. And I'm going to show you these words. I'd like you to know these words too, because they apply to mosses as well. Plants don't have testes. They don't have ovaries, because a testes by definition makes sperm by meiosis. Same with an ovary, makes an egg by meiosis. Plants don't do that. So their gametophytes make sperm in a structure known as an antheridium, and they make eggs in a structure known as an archegonium. I don't know why it helps me, but I always think of Raiders of the Lost Archegonium. All right, that's where the egg is found. So sperm still swim to the egg here. So mosses and ferns both need water for sex. They're like amphibians in that way. They need water for sex. So they don't need a lot of water. Just a dewy morning or a slight rain is enough, but they need sperm to swim to the egg. So sperm fertilizes the egg. That is a zygote now. It grows into a sporophyte, which grows up to be a new fern. Just like the moss life cycle, except we have a few more bigger organs, although the moss does have antheridia and archegonia. The sporophyte itself, the big diploid plant, is big here instead of small, and the gametophyte is small instead of big. Now, vascular tissues have evolved here. Xylem, which carries, which is got a lot of cellulose in its cell walls, and lignin, which make them even stronger. that makes up those tubes, and they're strong tubes. If you add a bunch of them together, you get wood. Ferns don't have wood, but they have a lot of xylem, or they have xylem to transport water from their roots to their leaves. Phloem is living, and it transports sugars and hormones. Okay, we've talked about that already. Now, during the Paleozoic era, we have tons of these things, and these are the dominant forms of life on the planet. Seedless plants. They don't make seeds. They have spores that grow into gametophytes, and gametophytes have sex to make sporophytes. That's what we see all over the landscape during this era. First, we start out with moss-like plants that are small, hug the ground, rely on osmosis. Then we adapt to land. How do we adapt to land? We grow roots to really absorb water from the ground. We have vascular tissue to help move water around. That lets ferns get bigger and taller because they have vascular tissue now. They can get further up off the ground and still transport water to the top. And what we'll see when we get to seed plants is we're going to eliminate the need for water for sex. It's almost like internal fertilization in reptiles and mammals. We have a new way of having sex when it comes to seed plants, which is what we'll talk about more next week. Now, one thing I want to point out is when ferns make spores, they do so, their sporangia are found on the bottoms of the leaves in these clusters. I want to show you that simply because and here's another kind of fern. This fern actually has a protective covering over its sporangia, but a lot of people think this is some kind of disease and they like pry it off of their fern, and you're ripping off its reproductive organs, and it's not very nice. So those are normal. You'll find those on your ferns that you have growing at home. It's fine. So if you look at a sporangium, here's one. It has this weird structure on top called an annulus. I won't test you on that term, but it looks like an accordion. When the cells up here dry out, these outer cell walls collapse and they break the annulus open, and then it flings forward and it throws the spores out into the air. Those spores, once again, are one cell big, covered in a layer of sporopollenin. Here's a picture of a fern spore that I had analyzed I took a picture of under a microscope. This is a fossil spore from the time of the dinosaurs, from the Cretaceous. Those spores, that one's not alive, but the outer shell of those spores is really strong, made of sporopollenin, lasts a long time. That sporopollenin prevents the cell inside from drying out and dying in the terrestrial environment. All right, so we've seen some of these adaptations, and I've made a data matrix so you can make your own cladogram. A lot of you already made a cladogram similar to this on exam 2, and a lot of you did a good job of it, but I want everyone to try this. So here we have something that unites green algae, mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, angiosperms. So green algae is our outgroup. They all have chlorophyll A and B. Okay. Protected embryo. What do I mean by protected embryo? Well, remember that organ I showed you kind of looked like this? It had an egg inside. It's called an archegonium. That protects the embryo once that egg is fertilized. So a fertilized egg is called a zygote. As soon as it divides by mitosis even one time, it's called an embryo. That embryo is protected inside the archegonium. So it's protected from the sun and from the wind and things like that. Okay? So we don't see that in green algae, but in the embryophytes, the plants, the land plants, we see protected embryos in every group. Sporophyte dominant. Remember what that means. That means who has sporophytes that live a long time. Vascular tissue. Who has vascular tissue? Who has seeds and pollen? I'll give some of this away. I'll fill this matrix out for you. You can use it to then build a cladogram. But let me introduce the two groups we're going to see next week. We talked about mosses. We talked about ferns. Ferns have vascular tissue, right? They have roots and leaves and all that. They have a dominant sporophyte life cycle. Their sporophyte lives a long time. Same with everybody else up here after the ferns. Gymnosperms are the groups like conifers. They make cones and they have seeds in their cones. Gymnosperms. Angiosperms are the flowering plants. Okay, so think of like pine tree versus, I don't know, a lemon tree that makes flowers and fruits, right? Angiosperms make fruits. Gymnosperms make cones for the most part. We'll talk more about those next time. But if we fill out the data matrix in total, you can see it on the PowerPoint online. It'll look something like this. So see if you can build a cladogram of plants using this data matrix. I'll leave that up to you. All right, this is the last lecture for week 1 online Bio 2. We will continue after break. Have a good break. Stay healthy. We'll talk soon.